Hi, I am Cesar Santos. I'm here at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I want to play a visual game and see if we can detect elements of design and how they evolve through time. Let's go. I'll be brainstorming, thinking of meaning and aesthetics. So I'll be saying simple stuff about each period and see how they relate to each other and how they grew, okay? In Egyptian art, for example, they represented the human form in profile, the faces in profile, the torsos facing the viewer, and the legs also in profile. And then the arms will describe the actions of the individual or the gods. This simplicity of representation was meant to be easily legible, almost like writing. They had a strong relationship between their gods and the people, so the art was about that relationship. Color-wise, they were very limited. The palette was basically earth colors, reds, yellow ochres, and some other few colors, blues, etc. Let's move. The Greeks are exploring with the gesture of the human, but still in relationship to their gods. The palette is still limited as we see it in Pliny's book, pretty much the four colors of black, white, red, and yellow. The sculptures are exploring these forms and this idealization and perfection of the human body. With Roman art, we already see a tendency towards realism. Now the figures are a little bit more stiff than the Greeks that had more gesture. So the Romans have less gesture, but not as much as the Egyptian ones. So the Egyptians were super stiff, ancient Greece, super moving, exploring movement, and then Romans are becoming more naturalistic and more realistic. But still, that relationship with the past and their gods. In medieval art, we see elements of previous art, but focus more into one god, the idea of the father, the mother, and the son. It's about storytelling, it's about morality in society, it's about the idealization of human behavior in relationship to their society and their gods. And we see even from this instance how the future will be part of that relationship of the family and the individual, just by the way they represented the nucleus of what's important in relationship to the idealized, to the ideal. Through Byzantine art and early Renaissance, we see a development of the outline and the masses of values of dark and light. And there is also an intent to represent the individual as we are in nature. As we evolve and science evolve and technology with the tools evolve, we see a better representation. So now we're getting away from this stylized art and we are becoming a little bit more organic. But still, no brush strokes, no lost and found edges, no shadow shapes. The Renaissance artists started to realize light and dark a little bit more developed. As we go into mannerism, we see more the individual being distorted again. So we go from this idealized perfection throughout time, and now we are having more of the individual problems and dark moments. We embrace the Baroque era with the dramatic effects, and the Venetian artists started applying more paint, and now is when we start using the tools to express more. And we see that development of soft edges and thicker paint application with the Venetian artists. And it's not until Rembrandt and Velázquez that we see more of the paint application as being part of the expression too. So now the paint application is thicker and the individual artist is expressing it from the inside and not so much from the outside for the people. Even though the art at this time is still narrative and still relating to the bigger aspects of our lives, there is a sense of the natural artist expressing more from his personal point of view. With classicism, we see kind of a going back into that idealized era of ancient Greece, having more of that render finish, smooth forms and bulky volumes. Romanticism in turn goes back to the individual and shows that emotional aspect of the human being. As science and technology evolved, we see faster changes throughout the period. Before, the changes would take longer amount of time. As science evolved and technology evolved, the changes became faster and faster. So even in the 19th century, we see this fight between the individual and the universal, expressing and fighting for space. Responding to that romanticism and the distortion of the human emotions, we see a return to the academicism, the formal way of representing art, like Bouguereau, for example, or Cabanel. After this, just the explosion of the Impressionism, which changed art forever. That's why Rembrandt and Velázquez and Greco and figures like that, Goya, even though they're a little bit different from each other, but still they represented that individual input in the arts. They expressed through the medium, through the oil, self-expression that will talk a little bit more about the subject in a more advanced way. And that's what took art to a different level. Artists like Courbet, Manet, and these more expressionistic artists, I mean, it's not expressionism, but they were expressing themselves a little bit more boldly, were the precursors to the Impressionists, where they just forgot about line work, they forgot about the basic brown colors, the black colors that were used in the past. They started applying paint according to science. These artists were not about storytelling anymore. They were not about idealization anymore, with science as the main influencer. But still, even the Impressionists were concerned with the image, with the paint application, with representation. In the 19th century, we also see a change of perspective. We abandoned the gods in the arts, and it became more about the individual and the personal problems and society. So we get to the Impressionists, and they abandoned a lot of the traditional forms of expression, like the earth colors, the browns, the blacks, and outlines, form, blending. All this stuff was abandoned, and now they were more expressive with brushwork, with color application. It was more the relationship between them and the environment, and studying the visual field in front of them. But composition was always a key factor. Even though they were not doing it the same way, they were still thinking about placements and how they would play with light and dark and all the values. With the artist and culture distancing itself from God and the expression, we see almost like a psychological introspection, distortion. So now even the Impressionists look formal next to this type of application where even the objects are distorted, the angles are awkward, and maybe that's a reflection of ourselves and how society is changing direction from the ideal into that trauma of the individual. We are becoming more intellectual too, so we're using more our minds and our concepts to express ourselves as artists, abandoning that beauty and abandoning the collective in exchange for the individual expression. So with modern and contemporary art, we totally lost the sense of representation. And now the explanations became what represented the piece. So it's funny because they put abstract work or conceptual art, but they still would describe it. So in a sense, it's still realistic because they wanted to make sense out of it. Art became fragmented after the modern era. Every artist for themselves, expressing individual emotions and expressing their point of view with whatever materials they wanted to work with. So there were no more standards. The only standard was to create a new reality for people that was never seen before. Postmodernism was more about sarcasm and making commentary about culture, glamour, self-indulgence. We don't create in a vacuum. We can look back and see where we come from with all the information that we have available to us and decide as artists how we want to express ourselves in our time as individuals. How do we create a new reality for people to advance? Let's wrap this video up. I know you want me to paint, but I'm here at the mat looking for patterns to learn before my brushes get wet. Cheers.